Good afternoon, everybody. I am watching all of the little dots as folks are getting logged in. Everyone joining at the same time. Looks like most of us have managed to get their audio going in our listening. So I'm going to start talking. So thank you for joining us. Molly and I, so my name is Dana Kuhnlein. I work with ReImagine Appalachia. Molly and I with ReImagine Appalachia had the pleasure of viewing Anthony's presentation at an event a few months back. And halfway through, we looked at each other and like passed a note that was like, this would be perfect for a ReImagine event. So hopefully you agree with us. So we both thought his excellent research and presentation would be really powerful for folks, specifically working in ReImagine Appalachia at that intersection of labor and community development and racial justice and environmental justice. He does a great job of cutting through to the values that we share in our community. Those values for things like a brighter future or more opportunities for working class and Appalachian people, safety and health of our children, that can somehow get lost in translation when we're actually working on these issues in our local communities. Even though we might have so much in common with the person we're talking to, all these things get in the way. So I won't talk too much for you, Anthony, but I just want to say, as we're working to secure these unprecedented investments for our communities, I think now is a perfect time to talk about how we talk about what we do. So this is a two-part event. Today is part one. If you have not registered for part two, we highly recommend it. Today, it's going to focus on looking at the underlying economic, political, and cultural causes of the rural-urban divide. And the second part, which is going to be on February 8th, is looking at how to develop strategies to move past those divisions. So Anthony Flaccavento lives in Southwest Virginia. He's the co-founder of the Rural Urban Bridge Initiative, which, as we had to clarify, is a metaphorical bridge, not a literal bridge, because we do so much infrastructure work. This group works to diffuse hostility and contempt and find mutual understanding and common ground, build multiracial working and middle-class rural solidarity between rural, suburban, and urban dwellers. Anthony is also a farmer, a rural development consultant, the founder of Scale Inc. and RUBI. And he has experience running for Congress in a very red district, as well as many, many more incredibly inspiring pursuits, building new economic opportunities in his community. So anyway, I said I would let you speak for yourself, and then I kept talking about you. So now I'm definitely going to hand it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Dana. Much appreciated. And I'm just going to jump right into the shared screen because I think people want to kind of hear the content, see the content. And on top of that, I think that I got a lot of material. So I want to make sure that we have time for discussion. As Dana said, this is part one of two, with next week at this time being the second part. The focus today is like 100% on the problem, the underlying causes, kind of what's gone wrong. So if you're anxious for the strategies and the solutions, come back next week and invite others to come as well. So we're going to talk about this. And a couple of things I want to mention as we move forward. These are sort of broad, almost caveat slides in a way, is that first of all, when we're talking about rural, we're talking a lot about working class, but it's not one and the same, but it's certainly related. And part of this, as we talk about the working class, is to recognize that the working class isn't all the same. The founder of Work in America, Karen Nussbaum, talks about 1/3 of folks being with us, 1/3 of folks being definitely against us forever, and 1/3 roughly that are persuadable. And that's RUBI's sense too, from the research we've read. So when I'm talking about people and how to reach them and everything else, we're not talking about every single person that opposes us, including what Andy Levison calls the extremists. We're talking about people who are potentially persuadable if we do the right thing, talk the right way, etc. So that's who we're really focused on. Andy Levison refers to this subset of working folks and rural folks as cultural traditionalists. very good folks, many of our neighbors who do adhere to perhaps more conservative cultural traditions and mores, but are not entirely closed-minded and are certainly not extremists. And let's remember too that although in parts of Appalachia, certainly where I am in Southwest Virginia, it is overwhelmingly white, that as a whole, rural America has plenty of folks of color, and that actually among Blacks, Latinos, Native Americans, there are higher proportions of working class people than among whites. So when we talk about the working class, when we talk about rural, we're talking about a multiracial reality. Heather McGhee, in a book that I couldn't recommend more highly, The Sum of Us, takes on this question of race and what's happened over the last few years. And she says that the plutocrats have always known that solidarity is the answer, that the sum of us can accomplish far more than just some of us. That's why the forces seeking to keep the economic rules exactly as they are aim to cut off any sense of empathy white people who are struggling might develop for also struggling people of color. And that is certainly what not only the plutocrats, but the right-wing media machine has done incredibly effectively. So let's now jump into the underlying causes. And I'll apologize in advance for sort of the breakneck speed, but it is what you're going to see is like the distillation of 2 years and thousands of pages of research and many, many years of experience. So here we go. What are those kind of core underlying causes? Well, the first and most fundamental is the economy that just hasn't worked for most Americans. And by most, we mean statistically the bottom 80%, that's most of us. And to varying degrees, what that bottom 80% has experienced is stagnant wages, a lot of job loss, underemployment, and overall this strong sense, excuse me, of economic insecurity, the sense of not knowing what's coming next, whether it's a job layoff, a downsizing, et cetera. This insecurity and these other economic problems are widespread in the country, but they're particularly acute in communities of color and rural communities. And it's also sort of in some ways, it's concentrated geographically, with Appalachia, along with the Black Belt and the Rust Belt being places where this is a dominant feature. Ronald Reagan, 40 years ago, talked about how wealth, income, opportunity, and prosperity would trickle down. Well, it's been exactly the opposite. We do not have a trickle-down economy. We have a suck-up economy, sucking up wealth and opportunity from workers to a small group of owners, from Black to white households, from Main Street and all of the small mom and pop businesses or family farms to the biggest corporations, and from rural to urban, a lot of the latter in the form of resource extraction that has a tremendous human and environmental toll, but a minimal economic impact. This concentration of wealth, this sucking up and the corporatization that has accompanied that, it isn't recent. Now, the 2017 Tax Cut and Job Act that the Trump administration passed made it worse, much worse, by dramatically lowering the top income rate on the wealthiest earners and on the biggest corporations. But the truth is, it's been going on pretty steadily for 40 years, including through 16 years of Democratic president. So it's a bipartisan betrayal of rural. Now, I'll pause real quickly to say I'm not somebody, absolutely, who says there's no difference between the two parties. They're equally bad. They're equally hard on people. That's just not the case. But it is the case that when it comes to economic policy, both parties have been part of the problem in different ways and at different times to different degrees. Examples from the Democratic side: Bill Clinton eliminating the Glass-Steagall Act, which he did with a Republican majority of Republicans. Glass-Steagall was the thing that separated banking from investment, that kept Wall Street and investment firms from taking ordinary people's money and putting it at high risk, that kept investors from betting against people who held mortgages, and all that crazy nonsense that almost destroyed the economy in 2007, 2008. Well, Glass-Steagall was the thing that kept that from happening, and the Democratic president was the one who orchestrated the end to that. Similarly, Clinton joined the Republicans in championing NAFTA and all kinds of other international trade deals. And as a more recent example, President Obama, who did a lot of good things, nevertheless did very little. His administration did very little in the form of antitrust, and in fact enabled most major mergers, corporate concentration to proceed. So this corporate concentration, which is kind of the vehicle of suck up economics, has hit the farm and food system particularly hard. When a behemoth like Tyson decides to throw its weight around, whether that's offshoring some of its processors or dictating worse terms to contract farmers or any of a number of other things, it hits rural communities profoundly hardly. And that's because rural economies have tended to be, for many, many years now, simply much less diverse than suburban and urban economies. They're more, we in rural areas are more likely to depend on one or two big employers or one sector for the majority of our jobs and income. And so as a result of that, when something goes wrong with those big employers, when they decide to offshore, or if they decide they don't like union organizing, so they're going to close up shop or any of a number of other things, the impact in rural communities is far more profound than what happens in a rural place. It's happened not only in ag, but in timber, in coal mining. Of course, many on this call are very familiar with that, and in things like textiles, furniture making, which were small to mid-sized manufacturers that were particularly important in places like South Carolina, North Carolina, Southern Virginia. Dean Baker, the economist, talks about the difference in power between the professional class and the working class when he says, we deliberately write trade pacts to make it as easy as possible for US companies to set up manufacturing operations abroad and ship the products back. But we've done little or nothing to remove the obstacles that professionals face in trying to work in the United States. So it's hard for people from other countries who are coming as doctors or other kind of high education professionals to break in, but it's easy the way our trade deals are to send manufacturing and similar jobs overseas. A couple of examples that are particularly relevant for a lot of us in Appalachia are coal and timber. Coal and timber, both of which, coal and tobacco, both of which have declined dramatically over the last couple of decades. So in both of those cases, there was good things driving the decline. Tobacco's a bad thing, smoking kills us, we know that. And then similarly, we know that we've got to move beyond coal for a much more regenerative and clean energy future. Both of those are true. I absolutely advocate for them. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of rural folks depended on coal or tobacco. Tobacco was a good economic crop for generations in the region, as coal was, for all of its problems, well-paying. The perception from rural folks is that it was the urban liberals that drove the demise of those two things. And so again, that contributes to this sense of resentment and frustration about exactly who has cost people their livelihood. And one last element of this first underlying cause, the problem of the economy, is actual federal investment or public investment. Now, people like Paul Krugman, the noted economist who periodically writes about rural and says that rural people's outrage against the federal government is real but completely without basis. And one of the things that Krugman argues is that proportionally rural people get much more federal resource than urban. That's true depending on how you look at it, but it's not true in many very important ways, including, as this graph shows, that on a per capita basis, urban areas actually get considerably more funding for things like economic development and community development. That's been an on again, off again. Sometimes it's been about equal, but over the last 10 years, it's been decidedly more. So not only are rural communities bearing a bigger impact from things like NAFTA, trade policy, offshoring, closing, the impacts on farmers. But on top of that, fewer federal resources flow back in to help rebuild these economies. And it's even more the case when we talk about private philanthropy. So this betrayal, this bipartisan economic betrayal, has then created the ground for the second underlying cause of the divide, which is this very widespread and deep anti-elitism that has emerged, particularly over the last 12 to 20 years. It's been a strain of rural life for a long time, kind of mistrusting or thinking that city people don't kind of look down on us, but it's really intensified over the last couple of decades. Again, it started with this economic decline, but what the right has done masterfully is to convince a lot of rural folks that the elites are not so much the rich people, although that's part of it, but it's city people, liberals, Democrats, progressives, environmentalists, social justice advocates, teachers, professors, intellectuals, bureaucrats. It's kind of our crowd. And so Kathy Kramer writes about this in her book and calls it a politics of resentment. And in this book, which, by the way, is just one of several I recommend so highly, you can find the whole list on the RUBI website of great books to go in a little deeper. But in the politics of resentment, Kathy wrote a book based on interviews with rural people in 24 different small towns and rural places in Wisconsin. 5 years of sitting around coffee pots, chatting with folks who were meeting and getting their take on life. And what she found consistently was that rural folks felt that they simply weren't getting their fair share, not of power or influence or decision-making, and not of resources. So rural people consistently felt ignored and disrespected. And on the positive side, what she also heard over and over was that people really felt connected to their place. And that sense of connection is something many of us feel and many of us build on in our place-based community development strategy. So it's a good thing, but it also is that when people feel resentment, it's not only about their own personal circumstances, but when they see their places struggling or in decline, that adds to the resentment. Kathy grapples with the role of race and the interconnection between this rural-urban divide and race issues. And she absolutely acknowledges, as we all have to, that race and racism is a very major part of the divide. But she goes on to say that we fail to fully understand the perspectives of rural folks when we assume that racism is more fundamental than calculations of injustice. The way these folks described the world to me, their basic concern was that people like them in places like theirs were overlooked and disrespected. So Kathy is not arguing to pretend that race is not an issue or pretend that we don't need to deal with our historic racism in this country. But she's saying that when we assign race as the primary or only reason for the frustrations and the anger of rural people, we're overlooking their own calculations of injustice. In other words, their own sense that they too are getting screwed. This rural consciousness that Kathy talks about also comes up strongly in Farah Stockman's book, American Made, and in actually most of the experience and research that people have done into this. On our side, liberals, of course, we're always fighting for a fair and just economy, but oftentimes we don't talk much about work itself as something valued. The way a lot of working folks and rural people actually, they don't want a handout. They don't want to simply have a safety net that will keep them afloat. They want to work. We want to work. We want to be able to take care of ourselves and our family. And beyond taking care of ourselves and our family, lots of farmers, loggers, coal miners, and people in traditional rural occupations are proud to do what we do. People are proud that we raise the food that is consumed beyond our own boundaries of our farms by folks in big cities. Coal miners are proud, in spite of all the struggle that coal mining brings to people's health and the dangers of it, they're proud to have been the people that powered most of America's prosperity for the last century. So Farah notes in her book that too often we spend all our time talking about social safety nets and not acknowledging just how key work and occupation is to rural people. One other element that's really important about this anti-elitism, kind of an outgrowth of this anti-elitism, is the question of experts. And on our side, and by our, I'm kind of lumping us all together. I realize people will have different politics and perspectives. But let's say from the liberal point of view, you commonly hear our folks saying, why won't these people listen to the experts? But the experts aren't always right. Sometimes they're spectacularly wrong. Like when Bill Clinton and Robert Rubin said that the entrance into the World Trade Organization of China and the adoption of NAFTA would create 1 million net new jobs over the next 5 years. And in fact, it had exactly the opposite impact across small towns in rural America, where jobs were sucked out. Or here's another example of when the experts don't get it. Something called Hands Across the Hills is a dialogue between people in Appalachia and folks in the Northeast or in cities. And in one of those conversations, which was videotaped, this gal, Gwen Johnson, was talking to a gentleman from Massachusetts. They'd come to be friends through this process. And the gentleman from Massachusetts asked Gwen, what is it with vaccinations? Why are people in your neck of the woods, most of them not getting vaccinated? And Gwen said one word, OxyContin. She said, we were told it was safe, perfectly safe, and not addictive. The doctors, the pharmacists told us this. Government regulators agreed, said it was perfectly okay. And yet, look what it's done. It's devastated our community. So some people don't trust the experts on vaccines either. My point here is not to say that we should be anti-expert or that we shouldn't listen to experts, but my point is to say that sometimes the resistance to expertise, the hesitation, has at least some grounding in real world experience. The third underlying cause is the resistance to government, and in fact, a highly, highly negative strain about government. Now, this isn't just a rural thing, but it's stronger in rural. And when we say government, we're talking particularly about the role of government as a regulator, with environmental regulations being at the top of the heap of people, of the things that people resist in rural communities. Now, of course, it's really unfortunate and it's ironic in a lot of ways that rural people are more resistant to government regulation, particularly at the federal level, because an awful lot of rural folks are much more intimately connected to the environment. As fishermen, as farmers, as foresters and forest herb collectors, as loggers, all of those different occupations need a healthy environment. Now, of course, all of us need a healthy environment, but for folks in the city and suburbs, it's a more indirect relationship. But in the countryside, it's very direct. And yet, so many people in the countryside have developed what I've come to call regulatory aversion, the sense that regulations aren't necessary. They're intrusive. They're one size fits all. And anyway, they don't protect the little guy. So where does it come from? Where does that sense come from? Well, one is the fact that sometimes regulations, like the experts, fail spectacularly. It's coming up on 13 years ago that 29 miners lost their lives when the Upper Big Branch mine exploded. Here's the deal on that. For the year prior to April 5th, 2010, the Massey mine was cited over 500 different times for safety infringements, safety violations. Just in the month before the explosion, there were nearly 60 safety violations cited, but nothing of substance changed. So 29 miners killed, all those families, that whole community just devastated. You can begin to think people are going to say, what do regulations do for us anyway? And another element underlying the anti-regulatory is the sense that a whole lot of rural people have, that nobody listens to us. Nobody turns to the farmers or the fishermen or the small business owners, many of whom are innovative, many of whom are smart and coming up with new ways of doing things, but are largely ignored. Instead, people come from the cities, people come from the government agencies, they come from the universities to tell us what we need to do. So people like this fellow, Bren Smith, who I got to meet in Harlan, Kentucky, just get ignored. Bren is a guy who dropped out of high school at 15, became a commercial fisherman for the next 25 years along both the east and west coast of the country. And over time developed a system he calls vertical ocean farming that is this brilliantly integrated marine ecosystem where he raises high value shellfish, but does it in conjunction with seaweed and seagrasses so that he's actually cleaning up the local ecosystem and sequestering tremendous amounts of carbon while raising these healthy, valuable shellfish. Bren came up with that on his own. There's a lot of Brens around Appalachia and rural America, but they're not typically people that are turned to for expertise. The fourth underlying cause is what Arlie Hochschild has called the sense of feeling like strangers in their own land. Arlie's book, much like Kathy Kramer's, was based on several years of interviews, in her case with people in rural Louisiana. And what she found was this sense that people had that they were stuck in line and that others were butting in line ahead of them. They were feeling like they had done the right thing. These were people who'd worked hard, who'd played by the rules, but here they were treading water or even falling backwards while other people moved ahead of them. Now, again, what folks on the right have done is to successfully channel a real grievance that people working hard are not making progress. They're in fact sometimes going backwards economically in terms of security. But the right has managed to point the finger at people like women taking men's jobs, immigrants taking local jobs, people of color taking jobs from white people. All of this sending the message that those are the people they should blame. But underlying that misplaced blame is some real grievance. This sense of being strangers in their own land wasn't just what Arlie found, but others have seen that as well. In a big focus group project undertaken by the Democracy Corps in 2021, they found that Democrats and liberals envision the future very optimistically, a progressive place, exciting, culturally and ethnically diverse. But among white working class and small town people more broadly, they didn't see the future in that way. They saw it as an elitist society with no place for them, no place for people like them. And so there is this broader sense of alienation. And our last underlying cause is, so we have a two-party system for good and for bad. Historically, it was the Democratic Party that represented the working class, not perfectly, and sometimes in a manner that was absolutely not racially or gender inclusive, but overall, the party of the working class. But that party has become, as Thomas Frank and others have said, much more the party of the professional class. And we know that in a lot of different ways. Some of it's symbolic, some of it's substantive. Larry Summers, who was key in both the Clinton and Obama administrations, admitted that even though these cities in the Rust Belt had been devastated by NAFTA, they didn't visit them because displaced white workers just weren't heavily on our radar screen. That's quite a statement for somebody who's working for the party of the working class, supposedly. And then we have our own kind of version of what used to be the conservative value of pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, very much a rural and Appalachian value. But ours is a little different take on the liberal side. And it's around this notion of meritocracy, that pulling yourself up by your bootstraps now means, among many Democratic leaders and pundits and economists, getting a degree. Plain and simple, that's your path out of insecurity and into prosperity. Well, we all know that isn't a path for everybody, both for people who go through it and people who can't go through it. And we all know that people who don't have a college degree still ought to be able to work at jobs that are dignified and pay a livable wage. But meritocracy is our own form of bootstrapping. So in a way, from the perspective of a lot of rural people, on the one hand, liberals, progressives, Democrats have become more liberal on social and cultural issues, something that I embrace and endorse, and I'm glad for, but something that's a little bit off-putting, a little bit shocking sometimes to more conservative small town and rural people. But while we become more liberal on those social issues, not so much on economic issues, where the neoliberal policies on international trade and favoring investors over workers, tax policy, and other things. So we end up with a situation where neither party has really done a whole lot for working folks and rural people, but one party has learned to speak to and cultivate the anger while the other parties basically ignored it. So we have this one-party rule in rural America. And for those of us that are working on economic development, community development, creating a new economy, et cetera, that's not a good thing to have one-party rule, either party. It's not. And so overcoming this divide is not just a political thing, but it's key, we believe at RUBI, to more prosperity, more resilient rural communities and stronger economy overall. And we're not getting that now. And this one-party rule, we should mention, isn't just because of white people, because the Democratic Party and liberals have been losing support among people of color for several election cycles now. One of RUBI's partners is Cynthia Wallace. RUBI works with partners all across the country, and she's in rural North Carolina. Cynthia is a brilliant woman who, like me, ran for Congress a few years back, and she founded the New Rural Project, and their focus is on voters of color or people of color who might be voters. And what they've found is that in the post-Obama years, there's been a tremendous drop-off in affiliations for Democrats. So what you see here is that between 2008, the blue bar, and 2020, the yellow bar, voter turnout went up significantly among white people in their 7 rural counties of North Carolina. Stayed about the same among Black people, just an ever so slight increase, and then jumped among Native Americans, but among Hispanics actually went down slightly. More to the point, among younger people, those turnout rates were very different. A slight increase among white voters, 18 to 40, but look at that drop among Black voters between 18 and 40 over those 4 election cycles. And a similar drop, not quite as profound, among Hispanic voters. So what Cynthia and her group does is work to re-engage at the community level voters of color, particularly African-American, but not exclusively. And her strategy, which I don't have time to discuss here, but it's a really exciting strategy to bring, because part of the divide is people who are pissed off at us, but part of it is also exacerbated by people who've just given up on politics altogether. And because of that, what they saw in those 7 counties in North Carolina was a tremendous tightening of a race that used to be close. This was the results between 2008 and 2020 for the Democratic candidate for Secretary of State. And what was a walk in the park for the Democratic candidate in those counties in 2008, winning 74% of the vote, by 2020 had become an extremely tight contest. So what I'd like to do now is stop sharing my screen and ask Dana or Molly to bring up a video that I want you to watch part of. We're not going to watch the whole thing. This was done by my colleague at RUBI, Erica Edelson. And this is the last part of the presentation today, and in which we will be looking at the problem. And after this video, about partway through, I'll tell you when to stop it, Dana, then we will switch to Q&A. Sorry for I guess we're loading or buffering or whatever the heck.
Hi, I'm Erica Edelson, and I am here to talk about effective communication and how we on the left can do a better job communicating across lines of difference. Anthony's talked about how for the past 40 years or so, Democrats and liberals have become more oriented toward the interests of highly educated urban professionals. And what I'm going to do in this segment is talk about how that elitist orientation shows up in the way that liberals talk about working class people and about rural America. Flyover country, or as the Washington Post calls it, the country's dank backwaters. What I see happening is that sometimes liberals talk down to people who don't share the same outlook. They tend to lecture and scold and act like they know it all, and anyone who disagrees or even has questions is an ill-informed fool or a bigot. And sometimes it goes beyond smugness and self-righteousness to outright ridicule and demonization. And by the way, when I say they, I mean we, myself included. I've been as much a part of the problem as anyone. But I didn't want to say we, because there might be some of y'all watching this who haven't contributed to the problem. I'm going to show you a few examples of what I'm talking about, starting with a Taylor Swift music video. The video starts with Taylor Swift in the pool with a rundown trailer home on fire in the background. We don't know yet what the trailer is supposed to symbolize, but it becomes clear later. Then there's a bunch of fun, upbeat scenes where glamorous LGBTQ people are having a wonderful time, celebrating, dancing, having pride. It's all good. But then the toothless hellbillies show up with their hateful misspelled signs and ruin everything. Taylor Swift is using her cultural power to punish people who aren't as enlightened as she thinks she is. She's punishing them with shame, which is a very powerful emotion that makes people feel pretty awful. Every single researcher I've come across who studies hate groups says that the people who join them are drowning in feelings of shame and humiliation, and that the reason they join these groups is to regain their self-esteem. So using shame as a political weapon is a very dangerous tactic. I'm going to run through the rest of these examples without commentary because I think they speak for themselves. And as you look at them, try and put yourself in the shoes of the people who are on the receiving end. What happens when people are treated with this kind of contempt is they feel shame and anger, and they get defensive. Being verbally attacked triggers the same fight or flight reflex in the mind that being physically attacked does. The brain becomes preoccupied with protecting the person from getting hurt, and higher level regions of the brain responsible for empathy and logic and reasoning shut down so that no learning is possible. The chance of someone changing their mind when they're in a defensive fight or flight state of mind is pretty much zero. This is what defensive looks like. Trump knows this. What humiliation entrepreneurs like Trump are really good at is forming an us versus them bond of shared victimhood against the liberal elites who despise them. He knows that if he can make people feel vindicated instead of ashamed, that they will love him. This is a key part of Trump's cult of personality. There was an article in The Atlantic about blue-collar Trump supporters, and the reporter interviewed an Ohio steelworker who was the president of his local union, who said that he found Trump's insults exhilarating because they were a kind of revenge. And then he said, it's a mirror of the way they see us. You'll notice in this picture that Jack is protesting a lockout at his factory. And this brings up another very big problem I see with the habit of treating people with disdain. Very often it's class-based. It's punching down at working people, some of whom tend to be more culturally conservative, but can still be progressive on bread and butter issues. But when the media gets in the habit of casting them as deplorables, this can become an excuse for not meeting their material needs and not caring when they lose their jobs or their farms or their healthcare. When voters get the sense that liberals and Democrats are narrowing down their circle of care to the tiny handful of people who agree on every single thing and scolding everyone who's outside that tiny circle, then instead of joining forces for the common good, these working class voters become very much up for grabs by any charlatan who comes around and pretends to honor them. I want to show you a comment I came across from a New York Times reader a couple of years ago that I think pretty well captures what a lot of people who aren't part of the ultra-progressive left are.
Great, thank you. So Erica's video, which will shift in a moment to kind of what we can do communication-wise, we'll save those last 3 or 4 minutes for next week. But that's where I want to bring it to a close now. And again, it's kind of a pretty condensed version, but hopefully you have a little better sense of what those underlying causes are. And at this point, we'll take the final 20 minutes just for your comments, your questions, anything you want, with help from Dana and Molly in terms of looking for people who are raising their hands or folks who maybe have put a question in the chat box.
Yeah, and so we only had one question that was dropped in the chat, and of course that's your cue to folks to drop your questions in the chat if you have them. It's a little bit more, maybe a bit more of a comment, but just a recommendation of Eleanor Ostrom, Arun Agrawal's, I don't work on local environmental management in the Appalachian context. So anyway, perhaps more, so it sounds like a valuable maybe recommendation for further reading. I don't know if that is anything you can reflect on quickly. And then I see a note from Rick Wilson sort of saying the resentment entrepreneurs is a phrase that stuck out to him as meaningful. So yeah, and I might say for folks in the chat, just as we're getting going, you know, if there are pieces that really stuck out to you, that's another question we can ask.
A few things I'll say. I also like Erica's way of talking about resentment or humiliation entrepreneurs. That's a great way to put it. I don't know anything about the studies of Eleanor Ostrom or Arun Agrawala. I'm afraid I'll look into it, but I don't know anything about it. Sounds like there's some overlap there. The slides, somebody asked, 100% this recording and slides, as far as I'm concerned, are always public information. So feel free on that. And well, you'll get them, so you don't have to feel like you took all the notes, because I know I was moving pretty quick. And then in terms of a way to get involved in this work, let's just say yes is the short answer. And that we'll talk more about that next week. Next week, we're going to be talking about kind of what can be done from the local level on up to, you know, bigger questions of policy and whatnot. do you want me to keep going through the chat, or do you want to?
I might just pull one more thing out of the chat, and then we'll go to David and anyone else who wants to raise their hand and get in line. So Betty mentioned in the chat, I don't know if you have any reflections on faith and how that intersects. That's a notice that she's had in her community. If that comes up in your research at all.
Yes, Betty, it does. It's more of a, well, it's in the research, it's clear that in small towns and rural places, the local church is an important factor in both forming people's views of the world, good and bad views, and mobilizing. And church and state separation notwithstanding, it's a potent political force. Our belief is that part of the reason many churches in rural areas, particularly, but not exclusively evangelical churches, have become so politically potent is part of this larger sense of alienation that Arlie Hochschild talked about, the sense of being strangers in their own land. What churches give a lot of people, among other things, is a sense of stability, tradition, values and norms and practices that go back many generations, in many cases, many centuries. All of that is kind of like safe haven, something you can count on, something that's not dramatically different today than it was for your grandparents. And when the world around you is feeling increasingly insecure, perhaps dangerous because of economic and other trends, and the culture is feeling more and more alien, like, what are these people talking about? I don't understand the words they use, and I don't like some of the decisions they're making. In that environment of insecurity and a sense of being a stranger, alienation, the church becomes one of those institutions where really helps people feel grounded, helps people feel safe and secure. And so that's one of the reasons we see the church's influence increasing dramatically, and the churches themselves becoming, in many cases, vehicles for people to feel the resentment they feel, because it is that kind of grounding in an otherwise increasingly unfamiliar world.
Thank you. I think with that, maybe we'll move to David, if you want to come off mute and share your question or comment.
Again, my name is David Bailey. I am a economic development economist, and I'm originally from Mercer County, West Virginia. And I have lived in the Washington, DC metropolitan area with my work for ever since going out of graduate school in Virginia Tech. In the late 1980s or early 1990s, the state of Virginia tried a program. And Chuck Robb, who was governor of Virginia at that time, championed a diversification of the high-tech sector into rural Virginia. So he did this through the Center for Innovative Technology. And anyone who's gone through Dulles International Airport, that black upside-down pyramid just before you get to Dulles, that's the Center for Innovative Technology. And he wanted to create IT hubs that would allow more young people to stay in the local communities. And so these were done in Roanoke and Norfolk, Portsmouth, Richmond. And it lasted for about 5 years. And finally, the funding was pulled because unfortunately it didn't work. And one of the reasons why it didn't work, a key reason, is in the interviews they did with young people, is that they wanted to be around a core group of like-minded professionals. And so it was difficult to try to get young people to stay in these areas when they could go to more urban areas where you had a higher concentration of technology firms, that they could interact with their peers, that they could learn, and they had more job opportunities. So I think this is a challenge with regard to the rural environment that we have to address. Is the future of these rural communities is the youth. is keeping youth and making opportunities, viable job opportunities that they're interested in these areas. So I think that is a key challenge that we need to really address for the future. Over. Thank you.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that, David, and I'm quite confident that several of the people on this call either have that as a primary or one of their important goals of the work they do. And most economic community development people, even the more traditional ones, certainly recognize that when you lose a substantial chunk of your young folks, you lose energy, you lose diversity, you lose new innovation. So all of that's really very true. I would say that in a lot of the community development work that is going on, that I'm aware of in Southwest Virginia and other places, one of the byproducts of revitalization of small towns has been a return of young people. So even though the general trend is still towards outmigration of younger, we're seeing in Abingdon, where I am, and even little towns like St. Paul and Damascus and elsewhere, we're seeing both young people moving in for the first time, as well as people born and raised here who moved out, coming back in their 30s and 40s and even late 20s. And there is this new energy, but it's a chicken and egg for young people to stay or want to come back. Not only are jobs essential, that is obviously the driver, but they want to come back to places that are interesting, that have stuff to do, a music scene, a food scene, et cetera. And that's starting to happen, but it's obviously a critical, it's a critical need that isn't addressed well enough.
And Susan, if you want to come off mute and share your comment or question.
All right, thank you so much. This has been filled with light bulb moments, so I really want to thank you. And you've even inspired in me, maybe I will get a book club together to read all these books to really inform us. So I want to thank you for the recommendations. And all the work you're doing. I can't wait till next week. But I want you to, I think you may have disavowed me or made me realize this isn't so important. I moved out to Fauquier County about 1.5 years ago, and, worked really hard canvassing and trying to, move the dial out here in terms of the red versus blue candidates. And I've been working with some of the other counties with theirs with really sad results. So I've been trying to figure out what this is. And I started developing a theory, which I guess is just not important based on all these light bulb moments. But I do want to throw it by you anyway. I was wondering if we are dealing with kind of almost an old feudal mentality that a lot of these big landowners or major employers that employ a lot of people may be also kind of governing their thought process to their advantage, so that it's almost, I know for myself, there are moments when I just say, you know what, I don't want to participate in democracy anymore. It's too exhausting. It's and I don't want the responsibility of all this stuff because it's hard. And I would love to give it up for somebody else to make the decisions for me. And I was wondering if maybe there's a little bit of that with the corporations or the big landowners for their employees out here, who are basically saying, just go out and do what I tell you.
Yeah, I think that's a contributing factor, Susan. I hope I didn't disavow that. I wouldn't put that at the, well, I would say it's a contributing factor more than a fundamental factor, because there's no question that, let's just take the coal industry as one example, and there's plenty of others, that the coal industry built on, inflamed and exacerbated the divide in countless ways because it was to their advantage to do so. Whether we're talking about Alpha Resources or before them Pittston or Massey, they all mobilized miners, and not just miners, but the families of miners and even people not directly connected, in a kind of anti-Obama surge or frenzy. And they did it under the rubric of protecting our jobs and protecting our way of life. Now, it's to their advantage to do that, because that helps them keep environmental regulations or safety regulation intrusions or anything else at bay, to keep it minimal when they have that political power. So that's very true. And you could say that about big agricultural companies. You could say that about some of the big furniture manufacturers that resisted unionization and other things. Very, very true. I don't think they could do it nearly as effectively if they didn't have other reasons, like some of maybe what you're calling light bulb moments that we've discussed, to play with, to build on, right? So there's a general sense of negativity, skepticism, resistance to the government, to government regulations, to experts coming in and telling us what to do and what not to do. There's a general thing that's been building for 40 years. Then when the corporations jump in and say, these damn environmentalists coming from outside telling us we know how to do this, they're playing right into a game that's already been going on for a while.
So can I ask one other question?
Sure.
And thank you. So I'm not going to completely disavow that in my head then,
Yeah,
but put it in the right priority. So the other question I have, though, which you didn't mention, is I've been kind of wondering, healthcare is a big issue out here. There's a lot of seniors also. And I don't know why we're not getting more traction with those issues out here.
So one of the things on healthcare, and it's not the only one, it's true of antitrust policy. In other words, breaking up the big corporations or preventing mergers or forcing them into a more competitive environment. It's true of tax policy, that studies that have been done, basically surveys and polls, show these two things very consistently. One is that the majority, in some cases, a very strong majority of rural people across the spectrum, not Dems, rural people, are with those of us who think healthcare should be either universal or should be at least affordable and commonly available to everybody. They're with us on prescription drug prices being negotiated by Medicare and every other branch of government. They're with us on breaking up the big monopolies and fighting back in order to let smaller businesses have a better chance, et cetera, et cetera. They're with us on the issues. The same surveys and polls, though, when those folks are when those issues are talked about as being championed by a Democrat or as being a liberal that's pursuing them, then the support plummets. So in other words, people can be with us on the healthcare, as you say, and other issues, but if it's a Democrat conveying that, this is what I want to do, the support erodes. And that comes down to the fundamental fact that what all of these underlying causes have added up to for us is an enormous trust problem. And when we talk next week about RUBI's strategies to try to reverse this divide, we will be talking a lot about the deep mistrust and how to begin to rebuild trust. Because if people agree with us on the issues, but when we speak them, they don't agree, there's got to be a trust problem. I experienced this in my own campaign with people who would say to me, I think you're great. I'd love to send a farmer to Congress, but I can't vote for a Democrat. I just can't trust a Democrat. I heard that more times than I wish.
Wow.
So that's a lot about it. So what we'll talk about next week is how we do have winning issues, as a lot of progressive strategists have said, but we don't win on those issues because people don't trust us. And
Right.
So the issues alone are not the solution.
All right. Look forward to next week.
Thank you so much. There was one last question that I just looked up. I know we're over time, so apologize for that. But it was a question about, you share these concrete lists on why rural communities, have a tendency to distrust these urban communities. Is there a vice versa? Is there resources that folks can look at as to sussing out the reasons that urban liberals have distrust and disconnect to rural communities? So I'm mostly we can talk about this next week or flag it, but if there are good books or resources or folks doing this kind of work, I wanted to see if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, a couple of things about that, and we will get into that more deeply next week. So generally, the progression for liberals, progressives, Dems, I'm putting them on a kind of continuum, us on a continuum. Generally, the progression has been within our circles towards higher and higher in education. And with that more formalized education has come different preoccupations, different priorities, different ways of talking. You know, I've often said, because I've been very involved in the local food movement, that if we want local foods to appeal to everyday people and local farmers, we can't become obsessed with arugula and kohlrabi. Arugula and kohlrabi are kind of symbols of elitism. And, you know, I like them myself, but really that's kind of a silly little example of the trend that has increasingly isolated city folks and liberal people, I'm making generalizations, from country folks and conservative people. It's the markers of who we are. And so as we've gone further into these bubbles, there's been less and less available for educated elites, the very liberals that country people don't trust. There's less and less for us to empathize with and understand rural people. Rural people, working class folks, farmers, are represented to our class usually through a pretty skeptical or negative filter. And I had the slide about Paul Krugman, but Paul Krugman writes about rural every so often. And when he writes about it, his writing is basically throwing up his arms, saying, these folks are bad off. Nobody knows why. It's all irrational. And we just have to hope that something changes, that they kind of see the light. That's the kind of information that comes to city folks about rural people, about working class folks. And so our own kind of default to a misunderstanding of rural is fueled by the lack of good information and interaction. We think it's only the other side that lacks good information. We think they're low information voters, they're uneducated, but we have our own serious gaps in information, in understanding, and in education.
I appreciate that so much. And your arugula comment inspired some fun things in the chat. And I made the comment that I think dandelion greens and arugula might be in a similar kind of like basis in a salad, and yet they have very different, even though they're very similar, they have very different branding, right? And so maybe that's my new example. We talk about two things that are almost the same, and yet people have completely different opinions on them just because of where they grew up and how they were raised. So anyway, we're gonna have to let y'all go. Obviously there's tons of energy for this conversation, so we can't wait to talk to you all about it next week. Thank you so much, Anthony, and for everybody else for your engagement, making it more exciting for us.
Thanks to you all. Appreciate it.
Great. And you're getting lots of